Those disgusting, rodent-infested hay bales have to be gone by Friday, or we'll have them removed and bill you for the privilege, Mr. Caldwell. This is your final warning." The voice, a grating symphony of entitlement and cheap perfume, sliced through the quiet afternoon air. It belonged to Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, a woman whose physical presence was as overbearing as her personality. She stood just on her side of my property line, a flimsy piece of string tied between two survey stakes, as if it were the Berlin Wall. Her floral muumuu fluttered in the breeze, a garish flag planted on conquered territory. In her hand, she clutched a clipboard like a scepter, the official violation notice trembling with the force of her indignation. Her face, a mask of righteous fury, nose was flushed a blotchy red that clashed horribly with her platinum blonde hair. She looked at my field, at the neat rows of large round hay bales lining the upper crest of the hill, with the same disgust one might reserve for a chemical spill. I, on the other hand, saw a year's worth of hard work, a vital part of my small agricultural operation, and, most importantly, a critical piece of engineering. I took a slow breath, my gaze steady. I'd faced down men with far more firepower and far less certainty than this woman. After 25 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, retiring as a colonel, I'd learned that the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. "Karen," I said, my voice calm and even, a stark contrast to her shrill decree. "We've been over this. This is my property. It is not, nor has it ever been, part of your HOA. Once those bales are on my land, serving a purpose you don't understand." Her eyes narrowed. "I understand that they are an eyesore. They're attracting vermin. People who paid $500,000 for their homes don't want to look at your personal junkyard." The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. She was standing at the edge of a brand new cookie-cutter development, built on land that was a muddy construction site just 18 months ago, lecturing me about the aesthetics of a field my family had owned for 3 generations. "They are not a junkyard," I stated, the words clipped and precise. "They are part of an erosion control system, and you'd be wise to leave them be." She scoffed, a sound like a tire deflating. "Erosion control? Don't be ridiculous. They're hay. It's rotting. It stinks. Friday, Mr. Caldwell. Or my guys will be here. And trust me," she added, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, threatening whisper, "the bill for their services will be substantial." She turned with a dramatic flourish, her considerable bulk making the ground seem to vibrate, and stomped back toward her golf cart, the undisputed chariot of suburban tyrants everywhere. I watched her go, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was a declaration of war. Before we go any further into the battle for my hay bales, if you're enjoying this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. Or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare story. I read every single one. Okay, now back to Karen and her grand designs for my property. My land, this 100-acre parcel of rolling hills and oak trees, was my sanctuary. I bought it from my own grandfather's estate years before anyone dreamed of putting a luxury development called Whispering Pines at the bottom of its steepest slope. When the developers first came around, I had my concerns. The grade of the hill that overlooked their proposed site was significant, a fact I, with my background in civil engineering and soil mechanics, knew all too well. I'd attended the county planning meetings not as a protester, but as an observer. I saw the geological surveys they submitted, the drainage plans, the soil stability reports. Even then, something felt off. The reports seemed optimistic. They acknowledged the slope but downplayed the potential for significant water runoff and soil creep. They got their permits, of course. Money talks louder than caution. They built their houses fast and cheap, packing them in like sardines, all with pristine sod lawns and identical mailboxes. And at the head of their newly formed HOA, they elected Karen, a woman who had moved in from some gated community in Florida and believed her life's calling was to enforce beige conformity. My hay operation was a part of my life here. I leased most of my pasture to a local dairy farmer, But I kept this particular field for my own use. The hay I cut and baled wasn't for sale, it was for purpose. For years, I had strategically placed these large round bales along the contour of the upper slope. They acted as a natural permeable barrier. When heavy rains came, they slowed the velocity of the water sheeting off the pasture, allowing it to soak into the ground instead of gouging out channels and carrying away tons of topsoil. They were, in essence, a 1,000-pound biodegradable version of the silt fences and wattles we used in massive civil projects. They were ugly to Karen. To me, they were elegant, functional, and necessary. The first letter had arrived a month ago, a polite, form letter request to, please address the unkempt appearance of the adjacent property. I'd ignored it. The second was a registered letter, citing bylaws that didn't apply to me about storage of agricultural products and nuisance abatement. I'd written a polite, firm response explaining my property was not part of the HOA and the bales were a functional necessity. This confrontation, this final warning, was the third and most direct assault. It was clear Karen wasn't interested in reason. She was interested in power. She saw my field not as a neighboring farm, but as a rebellious province that refused to bend the knee. And as I stood there, the scent of her perfume finally dissipating on the wind, replaced by the honest smell of grass and earth, I knew this was a fight she was determined to have. Fine. If she wanted a war over a few hay bales, she had no idea who she was picking a fight with. She saw a stubborn old farmer. She was about to meet a retired colonel who had spent his career turning floods, mountains, and the laws of physics into manageable problems. Her petty bylaws were about to run headfirst into geology, hydrology, and the United States legal code. On Friday morning, the sun was barely clearing the tops of the oak trees when the growl of a heavy diesel engine disturbed the peace. Just as she'd promised, they were here. A massive, gleaming red tow truck, the kind used for hauling semi-trailers, was parked on the asphalt of Whispering Pines Circle. And behind it, a long flatbed truck idled, its empty bed a clear statement of intent. And there, parked on the manicured lawn of the house directly across from my gate, was Karen's golf cart. She sat in it, arms crossed, a thermos of what I presumed was coffee in the cup holder, a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across her face. She was wearing a pink tracksuit that made her look like a giant piece of bubblegum. This was her victory parade, and she was here to savor every moment. I walked down my long gravel driveway, not with anger, but with a deliberate, measured pace. I'd been up since 0500, as was my habit. I had already reviewed my documents, positioned my trail cameras to have a clear view of the gate, and made a fresh pot of coffee. Panic is the enemy of strategy. I reached the gate just as a burly man in greasy overalls climbed out of the tow truck. He had a clipboard of his own. "Morning," he grunted, avoiding eye contact. "Got a work order here to remove some, hay bales." He gestured vaguely toward my field. Karen, seeing the engagement begin, drove her golf cart right up to the property line, unable to resist being at the center of the action. "Just get them out of here, Frank," she barked at the driver. "The sooner the better." The driver, Frank, glanced at her and then back at me. He was just a guy doing a job. "That's the property owner, ma'am," he said. On a note of caution in his voice, I offered a slight nod. "That's right. I'm John Caldwell. This is my property." I spoke directly to Frank, ignoring Karen completely. "And I have not authorized any work on my land, nor have I authorized the removal of my property. Those hay bales belong to me." I held up a small stack of papers I'd brought with me. On top was a crisp, clear copy of my property deed, the parcel number and legal description highlighted. Beneath it was a recent survey map showing the exact location of the property pins, my gate, and the fence line. "As you can see," I continued, my voice as calm as a lecturer in a classroom, "this work order, which I presume was signed by Mrs. Miller over there," I gave a slight nod in Karen's direction, "is for a job on private land she does not own or control. If you bring that truck onto my property, you will be trespassing. If you hook up to my bales, you will be committing theft of private property, the value of which is several $1,000s, by the way, and it will all be documented." I gestured to the small, discreet camera mounted on the gatepost. "There's one there, another on that oak tree, and my main security system is recording everything from the house. High-definition video and audio. Frank's eyes widened slightly. He looked from my papers to the camera, and then to Karen, whose smug expression was rapidly dissolving into a furious scowl. "What are you waiting for?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I'm the HOA president. I gave you the order. You work for me." Frank, to his credit, was no fool. He was a working man who understood liability. He took a step back from the gate. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I can't enter private property without the owner's consent or a court order. My insurance would drop me in a heartbeat. Are you telling me you have a court order to seize this man's property?" The question hung in the air, thick and heavy. Karen's face went from red to a sort of pale, doughy white. A court order? That's not necessary. The bylaws, your bylaws," I interjected, my voice still level, "are a private contract among the homeowners in your development. They have the same legal authority over me and my land as the rules of your book club, which is to say, none." I turned back to Frank. "I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just telling you the facts. You come on my land, and I will call the sheriff and I will press charges. For trespassing and for attempted grand larceny. Then my lawyer will be in touch with your company's owner." Frank held up his hands and took another step back toward his truck. "Nope, not happening. Sorry, ma'am. You want this stuff moved, you get a judge to sign off on it. I'm not losing my business over some damn hay." He snatched the work order from his clipboard, tore it in half, and tossed the pieces onto the passenger seat of his cab. "You're still getting a bill for the call-out," he grumbled, more to himself than anyone else, and climbed back into his truck. A moment later, the big diesel engine roared to life, and the tow truck and flatbed pulled away, leaving Karen alone in her golf cart, enveloped in a cloud of exhaust fumes and humiliation. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish on a dock, but no sound was coming out. The silence was magnificent. When she finally found her voice, it was a screech of pure, impotent rage directed entirely at me. "You will regret this. You have no idea what you've just done. I will bury you in fines. I will make you wish you had never even seen this neighborhood." She slammed her golf cart into reverse, nearly clipping her own prize-winning rose bushes, and sped off down the street. The threats were hollow, but I knew the paperwork blizzard was coming, and that was fine. Let her send her letters. She was playing checkers. I was already setting up the chessboard for a much bigger game. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. True to her word, the deluge began. The first fine arrived 3 days later, delivered via certified mail, a classic Karen move to ensure I couldn't claim I never received it. The envelope was thick with self-importance. Inside, a crisply printed letter informed me I was being fined $100 for failure to maintain aesthetic standards as per Whispering Pines bylaw 7.4. It was accompanied by a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my hay bales taken from the street. I chuckled, circled the part of the bylaw that stated it applied to all lots within the community, and mailed it back to them with a copy of my property deed and a handwritten note. Not my circus, not my monkeys. This, of course, only fueled the fire. A week later, another certified letter. This time, the fine was $250 for an ongoing agricultural nuisance, bylaw 9.2, claiming the bales were a source of noxious odors and a breeding ground for vermin. This was pure fiction. My bales were dry, properly stored, and smelled of nothing more than sweet, cured grass. The only vermin problem was the one sitting on the HOA board. This second letter, however, gave me the opening I was looking for. Her accusations were no longer just about aesthetics. They were about verifiable conditions. It was time to stop reacting and start building my case. My first call was to my old friend and former subordinate from the Corps, Mark Peterson. Mark had left the Army a few years after I did, and now ran a successful private civil engineering firm. He was a wizard with geological surveys, drainage simulations, and most importantly, sniffing out shoddy work from developers. "Colonel, that you?" he answered, his voice booming over the phone. "To what do I owe the honor? Don't tell me you finally decided to build that ridiculous suspension bridge over your creek." "Something like that, Mark," I said. "I've got a little situation here with the new HOA next door. I need a professional eye on some development plans." I spent the next 20 minutes laying out the whole saga. Karen, the Bales, the threats, the fines. When I got to the part about the agricultural nuisance and the erosion control explanation, I could almost hear Mark's engineering brain kicking into high gear. They built at the bottom of that big hill, right? The one with the 30-degree grade on the north face, he asked. That's the one. And they're complaining about the very things you've put in place to keep that hill from sliding into their living rooms? The irony wasn't lost on him. You have no idea, I replied. So here's what I need. Well, I'm going down to the county records office tomorrow to pull the original development plans and all associated geological and soil reports for Whispering Pines. I want you to go over them with a fine-toothed comb. I have a feeling the developer cut some corners on their slope stability assessment. Say no more, John, Mark said, a new excitement in his voice. This is my bread and butter. Developers trying to save a buck by ignoring a few hundred tons of unstable soil. Send me the files. I'll see what skeletons are hiding in their geotechnical closet. The next day, I spent 4 hours in the dusty basement of the county planning department, poring over blueprints, surveys, and binders full of reports. The clerk, a helpful woman named Brenda, remembered the Whispering Pines project. Oh yeah, that one, she said, peering over her glasses. Juan, the developer, was in a real hurry. Pushed it through pretty fast. Had a lot of friends on the commission back then. That little tidbit was interesting. I paid for copies of everything. The initial proposals, the environmental impact statements, the soil borings, and the final approved drainage and grading plans. I scanned them all and emailed the package to Mark. His call came less than 24 hours later. John, you're not going to believe this, he said, and I could hear him shuffling papers. It's worse than we thought. It's not just optimistic, it's borderline fraudulent. He explained in precise engineering terms. The developer, a company called Prestige Homes LLC, had used a geological survey that systematically underestimated the soil saturation point and plasticity, and they based their entire drainage plan on a 10-year storm model, not the 100-year storm model that was standard practice for a slope of that grade and soil type. Basically, Mark summarized, they built the foundations right up to the minimum legal setback, assuming the ground would behave like concrete. They made zero, and I mean zero, provisions for significant uphill soil erosion. There are no retaining walls, no deep-rooted vegetation plans, no subsurface drainage. The entire stability of the backyards of at least a dozen of those houses depends entirely on the land uphill, your land, remaining exactly as it is, or better. I felt a cold, clear sense of vindication. So my hay bales, your hay bales, Mark cut in, are acting as a de facto, unpaid-for erosion control system for their entire development, where they're doing the job that Prestige Homes should have spent $500,000 on to build a proper retaining wall. If you were to remove those bales and you got one good, heavy, sustained rainstorm, that topsoil would liquefy. It would come down that hill like a muddy avalanche. It would overwhelm their flimsy French drains in minutes and slam right into the back of those houses. We're talking cracked foundations, shifted structures, flooded basements, catastrophic failure. The pieces all clicked into place. The developer's rush, the friendly county commission, the lack of proper site engineering, and now Karen, in her blind arrogance, was trying to force me to remove the one thing preventing a disaster. She thought she was enforcing an aesthetic rule. In reality, she was trying to pull the pin on a grenade that would blow up her own neighborhood. The war wasn't about my hay anymore. It was about their houses, and they didn't even know it. My next step wasn't to confront Karen with this newfound ammunition. A direct attack would only make her dig in her heels. In any campaign, you must first win the hearts and minds of the populace. My campaign in this case would be waged not on the battlefield of my front lawn, but in the quiet living rooms of Whispering Pines. I needed allies from within the enemy's own ranks. My dossier on Karen's reign of terror began with a simple walk through the neighborhood. I started with the house directly across from me, the one whose lawn she had used as her command post. A young couple, the Garcias, lived there. I'd seen the husband, she a Marine judging by the decal on his truck, leaving for work early in the mornings. I caught him one Saturday while he was mowing his lawn. I introduced myself, and after a few pleasantries about the weather, I got to the point. I imagine you had a front row seat to the show with the tow truck the other day, I said. He shut off the mower and sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. Man, I'm sorry about that. My wife and I, we think it's ridiculous. We actually like looking at your field. It's better than looking at another house. I appreciate that, I said. Tell me, have you had any interesting interactions with the HOA president? His eyes darkened. You have no idea. We got fined $200 last month because our daughter's playset is not a pre-approved color. It's forest green. But Karen said it needed to be taupe or beige. I shook my head in disbelief. Would you be willing to share a copy of that violation notice with me? Anonymously, of course. I'm putting together a little file. He broke into a wide grin. A file? Brother, I'll print you a copy right now. Anything to push back on that woman. He became my first informant. Through him, I got other names. There was Mrs. Gable in 4B, an elderly widow who was being threatened with fines because her prize-winning roses were non-native and disruptive to the aesthetic ecosystem. There was the Henderson family who were told their basketball hoop had to be taken down every single night or they'd face a daily fine of $25. The stories were all the same, petty, vindictive, and aimed at anyone who dared to show a spark of individuality. I collected copies of their letters, documented their stories, and organized them into a neat chronological binder. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about bullying and control. While gathering intelligence, I launched my own paper-based counterattack. I drafted a formal registered letter addressed to the HOA Board of Directors, not just to Karen. In it, I methodically and dispassionately laid out my position. I attached a copy of my deed in the property survey. I cited the specific county agricultural codes that protected my right to conduct normal farming activities on my land. Then I dropped the first bomb. I included a 2-page preliminary engineering assessment, written and signed by Mark Peterson, P.E. The report explained in clear, simple terms the function of the hay bales as an essential and currently active erosion mitigation system. It described the soil composition on the hill, the steepness of the grade, and the lack of any engineered retaining structures on the HOA's side of the property line. It concluded with a stark warning. The removal of these bales without the implementation of a professionally designed alternative would expose the downslope properties to a significant and foreseeable risk of substantial property damage from soil erosion and mud flow during any significant precipitation event. I didn't make threats, I simply stated facts and expert opinions. I was creating a paper trail, documenting that I had officially and professionally warned them of the danger. I was handing them the rope. As whether they chose to hang themselves with it was up to them. I mailed a copy to each of the 5 board members' home addresses. For good measure, I sent a copy to the HOA's management company listed on their letterhead. Let them all be on notice. The response came a week later. It was not a multi-page considered rebuttal. It was a single sheet of paper, signed only by Karen as president. It read in its entirety, "Dear Mr. Caldwell, the board has received your letter. Your attempt to intimidate the association with irrelevant technical details is noted. The Architectural Review Committee has reviewed your case again, and their decision is final. The aesthetic violation remains. Please be advised that fines will continue to accumulate until the nuisance is abated. We consider this matter closed." It was the single most arrogant, dismissive, and self-destructive document I had ever had the pleasure of receiving. She hadn't even bothered to consult the other board members, I suspected. She had seen my letter not as a warning, but as a challenge to her absolute authority. The decision is final. The matter is closed. Famous last words. I carefully placed her letter into a plastic sleeve and added it to my binder. It was Exhibit A in the case of Karen versus reality. She had just officially acknowledged receipt of my expert warning and had officially chosen to ignore it. In legal terms, this was a gift. She had just handed me the keys to her own destruction. The chessboard was set, the pieces were in motion, and Karen, in her infinite wisdom, had just voluntarily moved her queen into the path of my rook. The time for polite warnings and quiet intelligence gathering was over. Karen's dismissive letter was a declaration that she was immune to reason. Therefore, she would have to be introduced to consequences. It was time to bring in the heavy artillery. My next call was to Eleanor Davies, a lawyer whose reputation preceded her. Davies wasn't one of the slick television ad lawyers. She was a quiet, ferocious legal scholar who specialized in the dense, thorny thicket of property, contract, and land use law. She had a particular fondness for dismantling abusive HOAs. I laid out the entire situation for her in her book-lined office, presenting my binder of documents, my deeds, the HOA's letters, Mark's engineering report, the developer's plans, the stories from the neighbors, and Karen's final, fatal letter. She listened intently, her steepled fingers resting on her chin, a slight, predatory smile playing on her lips. When I finished, she picked up Karen's matter is closed letter and read it again. "Oh, this is beautiful," she murmured, holding it up to the light as if it were a fine jewel. "This single piece of paper transitions the board's potential liability from simple negligence to gross negligence. The foreseeable risk you warned them about is now a known and disregarded risk. Their insurance carrier is going to love this." She leaned forward, her eyes glinting. "Mr. Caldwell, we are not going to sue them. Not yet. Suing is messy, expensive, and it makes you the aggressor. We are going to let them complete their own self-immolation. We are simply going to pour the gasoline." Her strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and lethality. We weren't going to file a lawsuit. We were going to put the board members on notice of their own personal, individual liability. Ms. Davies spent the next 2 days drafting a document she called a Notice of Impending Liability and Reservation of Rights. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. The notice was addressed not to the HOA as a corporate entity, but to each of the 5 board members by name, personally: Karen Miller, Tom Chen, Vice President, Janet Peterson, Treasurer, and 2 others, a Mr. Smith and a Mrs. Davis, who were just rubber-stamping members at large. The document was 12 pages long. It began by recapping the entire timeline of events, referencing every letter and every warning. It attached as exhibits my property deed, Mark Peterson's full, notarized engineering report, now expanded to 20 pages with topographical maps and soil liquefaction charts, and Karen's matter is closed letter. The core of the document, the legal payload, was in a section titled Exposure to Personal Liability. In language that was impossible to misinterpret, Ms. Davies explained that their directors and officers' D&O insurance policy, which normally protects board members from being sued personally for their decisions, almost certainly contained an exclusion for acts of gross negligence or willful misconduct. She spelled out that their continued documented refusal to acknowledge a professionally certified safety risk, after being explicitly warned, would almost certainly be defined as such. The notice then stated in bold, 9 underlined text, "Be advised that should the HOA or its agents take any action to remove, alter, or otherwise interfere with the existing erosion control systems on Mr. Caldwell's property, and should any subsequent erosion, mudflow, or landslide event cause damage to any property within Whispering Pines, we will hold each of you, in your personal and individual capacities, jointly and severally liable for the full and total cost of any and all damages, repairs, and associated legal fees. Your actions to date have created a clear and documented record of gross negligence, and we have every reason to believe your D&O insurance carrier will deny your claim, leaving your personal assets exposed. To translate from legalese, if you touch my hay and a mudslide happens, we are coming after your house, your car, your savings, and your 401k. I assure you, and your insurance company will abandon you." We sent 5 copies via FedEx with signature required, 1 to each board member's home. We sent a 6th copy to the HOA's management company, and a 7th, the master stroke, directly to the legal department of the HOA's insurance carrier, whose name was helpfully printed on one of the violation letters. We weren't just telling the board they were in trouble. We were telling their insurance company that the board was actively creating a massive, uncovered liability. The effect was instantaneous and exactly as Miss Davies predicted. My phone rang 2 days later. It was Tom Chen, the HOA vice president. His voice was trembling with panic. "Mr. Caldwell, Tom Chen from the HOA board. We need to talk. I just got off the phone with our insurance agent. They're calling an emergency board meeting. They said they might drop our policy." I remained silent, letting him talk. Look, I had no idea about any of this engineering stuff. Karen just said you were being stubborn about some ugly hay. I've got a letter here from a lawyer. It says I could lose my house? Is that real? Mr. Chen, I said, my voice flat and devoid of sympathy. I warned you. I sent all of you a professional engineering report. Your president dismissed it. You are all on the board. You all share the responsibility. Yes, it's real. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the sound of a man contemplating the abyss. The gasoline had been poured. Now all we had to do was wait for Karen to strike the match. The HOA's hand was forced. Their insurance company, now fully aware of the ticking time bomb Karen had created, it demanded a full accounting. The board had no choice but to call a special homeowners meeting to address the urgent legal matter that had suddenly arisen. The notice was vague, but the tone was panicked, and it sent a ripple of concern through the community. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse, usually reserved for potlucks and children's birthday parties, was packed. The air was thick with tension and the scent of burnt coffee. Over 100 homeowners had turned out, drawn by the scent of controversy and the alarming rumors that had been swirling for days. The 5 board members sat at a folding table at the front of the room, looking like they were facing a firing squad. Tom Chen and Janet Peterson, the treasurer, looked pale and sick. The other 2 members looked utterly lost. And then there was Karen. She, like in contrast, seemed to be thriving on the drama. She was dressed in a severe navy blue pantsuit, her shoulders squared, her expression a mask of defiant authority. She was not a woman who backed down. She was a woman who doubled down. She opened the meeting, her voice tight with suppressed fury. Thank you all for coming. We have called this meeting to address a situation with an adjacent property owner. She avoided my name, as if saying it would give me power. This individual has refused to comply with community standards and has now resorted to legal threats to try and intimidate your board in this community. The room murmured. Most of them still only knew her side of the story. The stubborn farmer and his ugly hay. He is attempting to extort the association, she continued, her voice rising, by making wild, unsubstantiated claims about his property being necessary for our safety. These are scare tactics, plain and simple. It was my turn. I had not come alone. The Garcias were there. Mrs. Gable was there. The Hendersons were there. We were a small but united block. When Karen finally grudgingly opened the floor for comments, I was the first to stand. Mr. Caldwell, she said, the name dripping with disdain, I'm sure you have something to say. I do, I replied, walking calmly to the front of the room. I was holding a laptop and a small projector. And I believe it's best if I show you, rather than just tell you. Before she could object, I had the projector set up, and an image splashed across the pull-down screen behind her. It was the official county plat map, showing my property in green and the Whispering Pines development in yellow. Well, this is my property, I said, using a laser pointer, and this is yours. As you can see, I am not a member of your community. Now let's talk about why we're really here. For the next 15 minutes, I delivered a calm, factual, and devastating presentation. I showed them the developer's geological surveys. I put them side by side with Mark's analysis, highlighting the discrepancies in the soil data and runoff calculations. I used simple, clear diagrams to explain how water and gravity work on a 30-degree slope. The developer of Whispering Pines, I explained, saved millions of dollars by not building a necessary retaining wall along this entire property line. The stability of your foundations, particularly for the homes on this northern edge, is predicated on the assumption that my land will absorb the vast majority of storm runoff. I clicked to the next slide, a picture of my hay bales. These are not disgusting or a nuisance. They are a functional, permeable check dam system. They are currently performing the job your developer failed to do, and they are doing it for free. I then clicked to the next slide, a copy of Karen's matter is closed letter, projected for all to see. A gasp went through the room. I provided your board with a professional engineering report detailing this risk. This was their official response. I turned to the audience. Your president, acting on your behalf, was made aware of a significant, foreseeable danger to your homes, and she chose to ignore it. The legal notice you've been hearing rumors about didn't come out of the blue. It was a direct result of this letter, which demonstrates a willful disregard for the safety of your property. The mood in the room had shifted palpably. The whispers were no longer just curious, they were angry. Homeowners were looking at their own property documents, at their neighbors, and then glaring at the board table. Then I delivered the final blow. I clicked to a new slide, a spreadsheet. This isn't just about my hay. This is about a pattern of abuse. The spreadsheet listed, anonymously, the fines and violations I had collected from the other residents. Fine for a green playset, fine for non-native roses, fine for a basketball hoop. Does this seem like a board acting in the best interest of the community, or a president consolidating power through petty tyranny? The Garcias, Mrs. Gable, and others nodded, yet their own stories now validated in front of everyone. The focus of the room was no longer on me. It was a laser beam of anger, fear, and betrayal pointed directly at Karen. People started shouting questions. Is this true, Karen? Did you get that warning? Why weren't we told about this? My house is on that northern edge. Is my foundation at risk? Karen stood up, her face crimson. She was losing control and she knew it. This is a lie. He is twisting things. He is the one causing the problems. But no one was listening to her anymore. Tom Chen, the vice president, grabbed the microphone. Yes, it's true. We got the warning. She told us it was just him trying to scare us. I have the lawyer's letter. It says we could be personally liable. Panic erupted. The meeting devolved into a shouting match. A chaotic scene of neighbors arguing with board members and each other. Karen was screaming for order, but her authority had evaporated. She was no longer the queen of Whispering Pines. She was just a woman in a pantsuit who had gambled with her neighbor's life savings and lost. I packed up my projector. My work here was done. I had planted the seeds of doubt and watered them with facts. Now I just had to wait for the storm. As if scripted by a higher power with a flair for dramatic irony, the universe decided to weigh in. The day after the disastrous HOA meeting, the local news weather team began issuing alerts for a major storm system churning up from the Gulf. It wasn't just a spring shower. It was a significant atmospheric river, a slow-moving behemoth projected to stall out over our region and dump anywhere from 6 to 10 inches of rain over a 48-hour period. The meteorologists were using terms like historic, unprecedented, and once-in-a-decade rainfall event. For most people, it was a reason to check their sump pumps and clear their gutters. For the residents of Whispering Pines, and for me, it was the ultimate test of my predictions. The countdown had begun. The news sent a fresh wave of panic through the neighborhood. My phone started ringing. It was Tom Chen again, then Janet Peterson, then 2 other homeowners whose properties backed up to my land. The tone was no longer accusatory. It was desperate. Mr. Caldwell, what do we do? Is it really as bad as you said? Please. Well, you have to help us. I told them all the same thing. As long as my hay bales remain in place, they should provide a significant measure of protection. The system is designed to handle heavy, sustained rain. The worst thing anyone could do right now is disturb them. My lawyer, Ms. Davies, saw the storm as a critical legal inflection point. This is perfect, she said, her voice grimly satisfied over the phone. The threat is no longer hypothetical. We need to put them in a legal straitjacket. She drafted a new, even more pointed letter, an emergency injunction and final notice of liability. It was sent via email to all board members, their insurance carrier, and the HOA's management company, ensuring instantaneous delivery. The language was stark. Given the impending severe weather event as forecast by the National Weather Service, we must reiterate in the strongest possible terms that the erosion control systems, that is, hay bales, on Mr. Caldwell's property are now of critical importance to the safety and structural integrity of the Whispering Pines development. Any attempt by any party to interfere with, alter, or remove these systems will be viewed as a deliberate and malicious act of property endangerment. We will seek an immediate temporary restraining order and pursue all available legal remedies, including claims for punitive damages against the HOA and against any and all individuals involved personally. Any damage resulting from such an act will be considered entirely the fault of those who disregarded this final, urgent warning. It was a legal kill shot. It removed any shred of plausible deniability. It stated, for the record, that if they touch my bales now, right before a historic storm, it was a provably intentional act of destruction. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought even Karen, in her boundless arrogance, would have to bow to the combined pressure of her terrified neighbors, her panicking board, her furious insurance company, and the laws of both man and nature. I underestimated the depths of her hubris. For Karen, this was no longer about aesthetics or bylaws. It had become a personal vendetta. My public dismantling of her authority at the homeowners' meeting had been an unforgivable humiliation. In her twisted logic, the storm wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity. I could hear her thought process. If she could get the bales removed before the storm and the neighborhood survived without a major catastrophe, she could declare victory. She could stand amidst the aftermath and claim that I was a charlatan, that the danger was a lie all along, that she had been right to stand up to the bully next door. It would be her vindication, a way to claw back her lost power and prestige. It was a desperate, insane gamble, one that staked the homes of her neighbors against her own ego. And as the first dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, Karen Miller decided to go all in. She was no longer just a petty tyrant. She had become a clear and present danger to her entire community. The calm before the storm was about to be shattered by an act of supreme foolishness. The air on Tuesday morning, 2 days before the storm's predicted landfall, was unnaturally still and heavy. A pale, hazy light filtered through the thick cloud cover. It was 4:30 a.m. The world was dark and silent. But I was awake. A lifetime in the military teaches you to trust your gut. And my gut told me that an enemy, when cornered and humiliated, is at their most dangerous and unpredictable. I had left my security system's live feed open on a tablet by my bed. The low-light cameras bathed my property in an eerie green glow. At 4:47, my instincts were proven right. A flicker of movement at the far end of my property, near the secondary farm gate that opened onto a little-used county service road. Not the main entrance Karen had tried before. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom, then winked out. A vehicle, larger than a car, was pulling up. It wasn't a hired company this time. Karen was smarter than that, or at least she thought she was. No paper trail. No work order. This was a black op. The camera on the oak tree near the service road gave me a clear view. A beat-up Ford F-250, pulling a large flatbed trailer, rolled to a stop. A smaller vehicle, a compact tractor with a front-end loader, was already on the trailer. The driver's side door of the truck opened, and Karen's husband, a stout, red-faced man named Bill, whom I'd only seen tending his prize-winning petunias, climbed out. He was followed by 2 other men I recognized from the HOA meeting, the 2 board members who had sat silently beside Karen, her loyal Praetorian guard. Then the passenger door opened, and Karen herself emerged. She was dressed in dark clothing, a black windbreaker zipped up to her chin, a grim look of determination on her face. This was her counterinsurgency. I didn't move. I didn't run outside to confront them. My first action was to pick up my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. I had 2 numbers on speed dial, the county sheriff's non-emergency line and Ms. Davies. I watched the tablet as Bill and the others worked with a set of bolt cutters, snipping the heavy chain on my farm gate. The metallic snap was barely audible, but it was the sound of them crossing a critical line. They were no longer just trespassing. They were committing breaking and entering. They swung the gate open, and Bill drove the truck and trailer onto my land. They were officially, irrevocably on my property. My cameras were recording everything in crystal clear, night vision detail. I hit the first number. "County Sheriff's Department, what is your emergency?" the dispatcher's calm voice said. "This is John Caldwell at 1580 Old Mill Road," I said, my own voice steady. "I am witnessing a crime in progress on my property. There are 4 individuals who have broken through my gate. They are trespassing and appear to be preparing to commit felony theft and vandalism of my property with a tractor and trailer. They are on my land right now." I gave the dispatcher a description of the vehicles and the individuals. Please send a unit immediately. I am not armed and will not confront them. I will wait for the deputies to arrive. My second call was to Ms. Davies. It was 5 a.m., but I knew she'd want to know. They're here, I said when she answered, her voice thick with sleep. Karen and her crew. They've broken in. The sheriff is on the way. Don't engage, John, she commanded, suddenly wide awake. Let them get caught with their hands in the cookie jar. And are your cameras rolling? Every second, I replied. On the tablet, I watched them unload the small tractor. Bill climbed into the driver's seat and fired it up. The chugging engine was an obscenity in the pre-dawn quiet. He drove it up the slope, its headlights bouncing, and lowered the front-end loader, jabbing its tines into the side of the first massive hay bale. He lifted it, swung it around, and drove it back down toward the trailer, where the other two men waited to guide it into place. They were clumsy, but they were succeeding. They loaded one bale, then a second. They were dismantling my erosion control system, bale by bale, right before the biggest storm in a decade. They were so focused on their task, so wrapped up in their little conspiracy, that they never saw the flashing blue and red lights until they were already sweeping across the field. I waited until they had the third bale loaded onto the trailer. I wanted there to be no doubt about their intentions. Then I walked out my front door, my phone held up and recording, and strolled calmly down the driveway. I arrived at the scene just as two sheriff's deputies were getting out of their patrol cars. They had their flashlights on the stunned group, freezing them like deer in the headlights. Bill killed the tractor engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "Folks, what's going on here?" the lead deputy asked, his hand resting on his sidearm. Karen, recovering her composure, immediately went on the offensive. "Thank goodness you're here, officer. This man," she pointed a trembling finger at me, "he has been threatening our community. We are the HOA board, and we are simply removing this hazardous material from the area as per our bylaws." The deputy, a tall, no-nonsense man with a weathered face, looked from her to me. He then swept his flashlight beam across the broken chain on the gate, the tractor on my land, and the bales on their trailer. "Ma'am, is this your property?" he asked, his voice dangerously patient. "Well, no, but it's adjacent, and the bylaws give us authority." "So you cut the lock on this gentleman's gate and drove onto his land in the middle of the night to take his property?" the deputy pressed. "It's not taking, it's abatement," she insisted, her voice growing shrill. "We are abating a nuisance." I stepped forward into the light. "Officer," I said calmly, "I am the property owner, John Caldwell. These individuals are trespassing. They have destroyed my gate and have loaded my property, valued at over $2,000, onto their trailer with the intent to steal it. Here is my deed." I handed him the copy I had in my pocket. The deputy shone his light on it, then looked back at Karen, whose face was a mask of disbelief. Her authority, which worked so well in the clubhouse, was utterly useless against a man with a badge and a copy of the state legal code. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you and your friends to come over here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You have the right to remain silent." The world seemed to slow down as the deputies cuffed a sputtering, indignant Karen, her husband, and her two loyalists. They were being arrested, caught red-handed in the dark on my land, with the evidence of their crimes sitting right there on their trailer. It was a perfect self-inflicted wound. The trap I had laid, patiently and methodically, had been sprung not by me, but by her own blind arrogance. The arrest of an HOA president on felony charges makes for good local news, especially 2 days before a biblical storm. The story was on the noon broadcast. Community dispute escalates to pre-dawn arrests. They showed footage of my field, the broken gate, and the deputies leading a handcuffed Karen to a patrol car, her face a mixture of shock and fury. She and her co-conspirators were charged with felony conspiracy, criminal trespassing, and felony vandalism. The last charge upgraded from simple theft due to the clear and documented willful endangerment their actions had created. A point Ms. Davies' office made sure the district attorney's office understood. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. The HOA's insurance company, upon receiving the police report, immediately sent a letter to the remaining board member, Tom Chen. They were invoking the criminal acts exclusion and dropping the HOA's policy, effective immediately. Not only that, they were putting the board on notice that they would deny any and all claims related to the impending storm, citing the multiple, documented warnings that had been willfully ignored. The Whispering Pines HOA was now uninsured, leaderless, and staring down the barrel of a meteorological cannon. The storm arrived on Thursday, just as predicted. It started not with a dramatic thunderclap, but with a persistent, heavy drizzle that quickly intensified into relentless downpour. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind began to howl. For 36 hours it rained. It rained with a fury I hadn't seen in my 20 years on this land. I sat in my living room, watching the water sheet across the landscape. On the part of the hill where my hay bales remained, the system worked perfectly. The water slowed, pooled, and soaked into the earth. The ground held. But on the western third of the slope, the section they had partially cleared, it was a different story. Without the bales to check its momentum, the water gathered speed, saturating the topsoil far beyond its capacity. It began to move. At first it was just rivulets of mud, but soon those rivulets joined, becoming a thick, flowing slurry. A river of my topsoil, clay, and field grass was sliding down the hill. It flowed with terrifying purpose, right toward the backyards of the houses on Whispering Pines Circle. I watched with a grim sense of vindication as the muddy torrent overwhelmed the cosmetic French drains at the property line. The mud poured into the pristine, manicured lawns. It climbed the foundations, bearing patio furniture and prize-winning rose bushes. I saw the back patio of one house. It belonged to the HOA vice president, Tom Chen, begin to crack and subside as the earth beneath it gave way. The ground, a soupy, unstable mess, was literally sliding out from under their homes. The damage was immense. When the rain finally stopped and the residents emerged from their homes, the scene was one of utter devastation. 3 homes were severely damaged. The mudslide had buckled foundations, cracked walls, and flooded basements with a thick, foul-smelling sludge. The cost of the damage would easily be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more. The visual evidence was the most damning part. To the east, where my bales stood guard, the ground was wet but intact. To the west, where Karen's crew had abated the nuisance, it was a disaster zone. A clear, undeniable line of demarcation separated safety from catastrophe. The homeowners, their life savings now sinking into the mud, learned the next piece of terrible news from their insurance adjusters. Standard homeowners policies do not cover earth movement, landslides, or flooding from external sources unless clear negligence from a third party can be proven. And thanks to my meticulous documentation, Ms. Davies' letters, and Karen's criminal act, that negligence was not just clear, it was a matter of public record. With the anger of the community, once directed at me, now turned with supernova intensity upon Karen Miller and the board members who had enabled her. The lawsuits began to fly, not against the HOA, which was now a bankrupt entity with no insurance, but against Karen, her husband, and the other 2 board members personally. Her neighbors, the very people she had lorded over, were now suing her for every penny she had. She had tried to bury me in fines. Now they were going to bury her in judgments. Her desperate gamble to save her ego had cost her everything. In the months that followed the storm, the slow, grinding wheels of justice and finance did their work. Karen Miller, out on bail and facing both criminal charges and a mountain of civil lawsuits, became a pariah in the neighborhood she once ruled. Her name was spoken only in hushed and angry tones. The legal battle was a rout. In the criminal case, faced with incontrovertible video evidence and the testimony of the sheriff's deputies, she and her cohorts had no choice but to plead guilty to lesser charges of trespassing and misdemeanor vandalism to avoid a felony trial. They received probation, community service, and a court order to pay me restitution for my broken gate and the stolen hay. It was a slap on the wrist, but the real punishment was financial. The civil suits were where her ruin was truly cemented. One by one, the homeowners whose properties were damaged won massive judgments against her and the other board members personally. The courts found them grossly negligent, their actions reckless and willful. Stripped of their insurance protection, they were left completely exposed. Karen and her husband were forced to sell their pristine house in Whispering Pines, the one with the perfect lawn and the award-winning petunias, just to cover a fraction of the legal fees and the judgments. They moved away in disgrace, their suburban kingdom crumbling into dust behind them. The Whispering Pines HOA was effectively dead. The remaining homeowners, humbled and shell-shocked by the ordeal, were faced with the monumental task of cleaning up the mess, both literally and financially. They had to form a special assessment district to raise the funds needed to repair the damaged homes and, more importantly, to finally engineer a permanent solution to the erosion problem Karen's hubris had so violently exposed. One evening, a few months after the Millers had moved out, there was a knock on my door. It was Tom Chen, the former vice president, and a handful of other homeowners. They looked tired and defeated, but they were there. "Mr. Caldwell," Tom began, his voice strained, We came to apologize for everything. You were right. You tried to warn us, and we didn't listen. We let Karen run wild, and we all paid the price." I nodded, accepting the apology. There was no satisfaction in their misery, only a quiet sadness for the trouble it had all caused. "And," he continued, hesitating, "we wanted to ask for your help. We have the funding now for a proper retaining wall and drainage system. We've fired the developer's engineers. We were wondering, would you be willing to consult on the project to make sure it's done right this time? We'll pay you, of course, whatever your standard fee is." I thought about it for a moment. I could have said no. I could have told them it was their problem to solve, but that wasn't my way. The community, broken as it was still my neighbor. Restoring order was always part of the mission. "I won't take a fee," I said, "but I'll look at the plans. I'll make sure the job gets done right." The relief on their faces was profound. It was the first step toward rebuilding not just their homes, but the trust that had been shattered. The final scene of this drama played out not in a courtroom or a chaotic meeting, but on a quiet, sunny afternoon the following spring. I stood on the crest of my hill, looking down at the construction below. A team of real engineers, using Mark Peterson's firm as a primary consultant, was building a deep-set, steel-reinforced retaining wall, complete with a comprehensive subsurface drainage system. It was the exact solution that should have been implemented from the start. My hay bales, their job now done, were gone. I had tilled them back into the soil, enriching the very land they had protected. As I stood there, a small figure approached me. It was the young Marine, Mr. Garcia. His daughter was with him, chasing a butterfly in the tall grass. "Looks a lot better than a bunch of hay bales, huh?" he said with a smile. "It's a lot more expensive," I replied, a small smile of my own touching my lips. "Yeah, but it's right," he said, his gaze following mine to the construction site. "It's done right. Thanks to you. They wanted to nominate you for the new board president." I let out a short laugh. I respectfully declined. "Figured you might," he said. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the machinery work. The victory wasn't in Karen's downfall or the financial ruin she had brought upon herself. The victory wasn't even in being proven so spectacularly right. The real victory was this: the restoration of order from chaos, the triumph of competence over arrogance, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing a job finally done right. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and damp earth. My land was safe. The community below was secure. The war was over, and peace, like the deep-rooted oaks on my property, had returned to the hill.